The rise of liberal England and the triumph of popular sovereignty. The word liberal is essential to our political vocabulary in the 21st century. It was a new idea at the beginning of the 19th century. The root of the word liberal rests in liberty. It was an idea that was reintroduced to European vocabulary with the Renaissance, as Renaissance scholars looked back into the Greco-Roman period and saw how individuals could participate freely in their government, in a Greek assembly or in the Roman Republic. The reemergence of liberty as a political idea changed the face of Europe. It also evolved over the course of the 19th century. In the beginning of the 19th century, a liberal was for allowing individuals to shape their own future. Occupation, freedom of assembly, freedom of press. Individuals ought to be able to control their own destiny. But over the course of the 19th century, liberalism changed. More and more, it meant stopping abuses of political and economic power. That political units, kings, parliaments, city councils, as well as economic actors, corporations, bosses, they together can hinder individual development, individual freedom. And so removing obstacles to individual choices no longer counted as sufficient for liberalism. Allowing individuals to shape their own future is certainly necessary for liberalism, but just as important is stopping the abuses of political and economic power. That concentrations of political power, concentrations of economic power can hurt individual liberty. And so the goal of a 19th century liberal, late 19th century liberal, was putting restrictions on political and economic authorities. That together, limitations on political figures, limitations on economic actors, created greater freedom for the individual. It was not simply removing obstacles out of the way, but it was also then restraining abuses of political and economic authority. This could help individuals make the most of life. Individuals needed to be free to make decisions, and also individuals needed to be free from harm or abuse from power. Together, these changes created a liberal England. That development of liberal England would not have been possible without popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty comes first, liberalism comes second. As more people enter into the political arena, they demand greater protections for themselves. And so popular or mass participation made government responsive to more people. At the beginning of the 19th century, this was seen as bad, right? It's opening the door to a French Revolution, it's opening the door to a mob. But by the end of the 19th century, large swaths of Europeans started realizing, hey, if a king can use government for their own personal advancement, why can't the people use government for their collective advancement? Because if a king has the final say, right, if the king has sovereignty, then the king's going to make a decision that benefits himself. But if the people have sovereignty, then the people can make decisions that benefit them as a group. that when more people do better, more people do better. So the development of popular sovereignty and liberal England go hand in hand. So there's the same constitutional structure. The Constitution of England does not change dramatically during the 19th century. There's a monarch, there's a lords, there's a commons. But there's a radically different distribution of power. The aristocracy and the middle class exchanged political reform for peace. The English aristocracy realized that they needed to bring in the middle class. And then the middle class realized they needed to bring in workers because there was a growing demand to end abuses in politics and abuses in economics. And if the government didn't respond appropriately, people outside the system would respond inappropriately. They would break things. So England, English political powers, elites, players, gradually shifted authority away from the House of Lords through the House of Commons and eventually to the voters as a whole, so that more and more voters had a say in politics. And so England kept this mixed government. The monarch kept the power to summon and dissolve parliament. The monarch kept the power to create peers. And so in the House of Lords, there were 350 hereditary positions. There were 26 Anglican bishops. There were peers from Scotland. There were peers from Ireland. They sat in the House of Lords at the discretion of the monarchy. The House of Commons was elected over the course of the 1700s and 1800s. They gained the power of the purse. The House of Commons set the budget. The House of Commons investigated ministries, conducted their own research into how the government conducted foreign policy, how monarchs spent money. And so in the 19th century, the House of Commons chose the prime minister, right? The prime minister, the first minister of the monarch. But in the 19th century, monarchs didn't have much say. Part of that was because Queen Victoria didn't want much say. She retreated from public life. She became a reigning monarch rather than a governing monarch. She left the business of government to her prime minister, and that prime minister responded to the House of Commons. The House of Commons set military policy, right? They funded wars. They oversaw war. They investigated war. And so while the monarch was technically commander-in-chief, it was the parliament who really set public policy. So this constitutional structure didn't change much over the course of the 19th century. What changed was the distribution of power. You go back into the 16th century, the monarch had most of the power. You go into the 17th and 18th century, the House of Lords had most of the power. You go into the 19th and the 20th century, that power then shifts down to the House of Commons. Why did the House of Commons gain more power as opposed to these other two branches? because the House of Commons answered to popular sovereignty. The House of Commons answered to more and more voters. And it became harder and harder for the English government to ignore the people. People wanted liberty. They wanted political liberty. They wanted economic liberty. They wanted the ability to create their own future, and they wanted the ability to live a life without being abused by either political or economic institutions. So we're going to start off with political reform, go to social legislation, and then look at the women's movement.